In this learn along, we're going to explore how to do retopology in Blender. This is useful if you want to take a 3D sculpture and be able to animate it or use it as a video game asset. If you're just rendering your models, this step isn't as necessary, but it's still good to know how to do. I'll load the caterpillar that we've been creating. And while we got it looking pretty decent, if we turn on the wireframe, I can see just how detailed this mesh is, which right now is way too detailed. I can also see all those little bumps and divots in the mesh. That's going to make it really hard to work with in the future, so we want those to be cleaned up as well. And just in general, we want to simplify it. That way my computer can actually handle animating it. If I try to use the tools we're familiar with, like remesh, it destroys the mesh rather than just simplifying it. So instead of remeshing or subdividing, we're going to use our first add-on, Retopoflow. You can find this freely available on GitHub. A little bit down the page, it has the instructions on how to load the add-on. We'll download the zip file, and then we'll go through Blender preferences to install the add-on. If I click Go to File, that's the source code. So that's what we don't want to download. We want to download that all packaged together as a zip file. Under Code, Download Zip. So I'll open that back up. Preferences. Navigate to where the zip file was downloaded. Activate it by checking the box. And now we can see it added it to our toolbar. Before I get started, I'm going to hide those mesh layers that we created before. We can see our detailed sculpture. I'll click on Retopoflow, create new target. And depending on your computer, this step could take a while. I'll start with the polystrips tool. And I need to make sure to turn on symmetry. I can see that the x-axis symmetry isn't what we want. We're going to go for y on this one, so we get the line right down the center of the model. And I want to follow this edge and just kind of draw in or paint in some new topology. Now I can't just left click, I have to hold down Control and left click in order to start drawing this line. I got an error message about having inverted or flipped normals. I'll save that issue for another time. I just want to keep going. What I didn't realize at this step is I could have made these polygons smaller by changing the size of the brush tool by holding down F. And then in order to increase the polygon count, I hit plus on the keyboard, or I could hit minus to decrease it. It's just not working quite right. So I'm going to change to the stroke tool. Hopefully I'll have a little bit more control. Holding down control, drawing my path. Then I use the tweak tool to move around my vertices and get that path a little bit cleaner. And I can see as I draw in the next one, it links to the green line. But the topology it's creating is still all over the place. So let's move on to the poly pin and get even more control. The poly pin took a lot of practice to get comfortable with. The first mistake I was making here was I was trying to build off of the vertices when I really should have been selecting the edges and building off of those. It was also set to triangles by default when I really want to use quads for animation. And while I was starting to get this to work somewhat, this isn't a very fast process, so it's not really utilizing the benefits of having an add-on like this. But in the interest of exploring these tools, I just kept going, trying to do the best that I could. I finally learned to adjust the brush size in order to gain more control. And when I'm on the tweak tool, I'm trying to keep the polygons somewhat even and rectangular, ideally more square. I don't want them stretched out. For the legs, I started to play with the contour tool, which allows me to draw two straight lines, and then it'll fill in the polygons in between. Worked pretty okay here. The next mistake I made is when I tried to do the next line, I went past the polygons I already had. And I really need to link these together next to each other in order for the tool to do its job. So I fumbled with this for a while. I found out that every time the polygons kind of stretched all over the place, it was because I had the wrong edges selected. And now I'm going to switch to the stroke tool so I can draw a curved line and try to follow the curvature of the caterpillar body. I'm making sure to draw my lines past the line of symmetry, just to make sure that they do connect. And again, I'm using plus and minus on the keyboard to control the number of polygons it creates. With the tweak tool, I'm also dragging vertices to snap together That way the two faces line up. When it works, this tool feels pretty powerful, but for the first couple hours, it was pretty frustrating to predict how I needed to draw these lines in order to properly have it fill in the polygons. One thing that it took me a while to master was making sure I had the same number of vertices and two lines that I wanted to fill in. At this stage, I'm just outlining the main features of the body. And then I want to use the patches tool to try to fill in this big space. This time I'm counting the number of edges and making sure it matches on each side. But I don't think I counted the top and bottom, I only counted the sides. So it's still going to come out a little wonky. It's almost there, but still a lot of manual cleanup with the tweak tool, snapping those vertices into place. And I made it work on the bottom of this seam, but I had a lot of overlapping geometry on the top, which would later come back to bite me. And trying to fill in this tail piece is when I started to wish I had planned this out a little bit better, because it's just not flowing very cleanly. When I have a vertice or an edge that's not going to work, I hit delete on the keyboard and delete that vertice or edge and try again. Right now I'm kind of just hacking it together, and this is going to catch up to me pretty soon. I've got these huge stretched polygons. I'll hit the plus key to try to increase the number. That way I can tweak them to be more evenly spaced. So if I step back, I can see that I got the start of it, but this process of doing it is going to be very slow. I need to get a little bit better with these tools. I'll delete my first effort. Now I'm going to reload Blender and start attempt number 2. Again, I'll hide the previous mesh layers, create a new target using our original sculpted mesh. This time I'm going to brush up on some of the shortcuts, looking through the manual. And I think instead of moving horizontally, this time I'll use the stroke tool and make vertical segments which will be more like how the caterpillar's body is naturally shaped. And so it looks a little patchy, but I found that once I move the camera, most of that artifacting goes away. And then I can use the tweak tool to start to move my vertices into a better place, even them out, snap them together. And I have a couple holes where I was expecting it to fill in. It was getting hard to control exactly how it was going to create the polygons. Again, I think I wasn't properly anticipating that the number of vertices matched on both sides that I wanted to fill in. So on the back of the head, I've got this spot that I have to use some triangles to fill in and kind of just force it to work, which defeats the purpose of having this clean topology. You can see that the triangles are starting to stack inside the quads, and it's just turning into a mess. Most of the body looks pretty good, but the back of the head really needs to be redone. Attempt number 3. You know the process by now. Use the strokes tool to form the main segments of the body. Trying to keep them at a consistent number of vertices. And it still didn't fill in certain parts. It created the vertices and edges, but no faces filled in. So first I'll even out what we already have. And this is what they call edge flow. So just making sure these lines that move throughout the model are flowing consistently. And again, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I do have the general guideline that I want to keep them squared off and fairly even across the model. So I need to divide up these large sections, these large faces. All right, so the body's getting pretty consistent. When I get to the front of the head, I don't know if a caterpillar has a nose per se, but that's when I have my first problem of how to bring all of these edges together. And I'll later learn that that's called a pole, and it takes a good amount of knowledge to know how to place these poles to get really usable and clean topology. And that's knowledge that I don't have yet, but that's a good thing to work on for next time. So it'll be the same thing at the tip of the tail. There's a pole where all of those vertices come together, and I have to be conscientious of how I want that to flow. And this is becoming a lot more obvious as I move on to the feet, which each one of them is going to have its own pole. Instead of forcing the polygons to come together through the poly pen, now I'm switching to strokes and trying to draw in where I want that pole. the first time I do it, I don't think I fully connected it. That's why I got this error message. Holding down Control and left clicking to draw. And so it was connected this time. I went a little bit past. Then plus key to bring up the polygon count. And then for between the legs, I found doing a half circle, since the symmetry's on, would connect it. But this would also be a problem later, because it's not really connected, it just looks like it. So when I try to draw in the pole on the inside, I'm getting more errors. So this front leg kind of came together. Between the legs, there's way too many polygons to express this, and I'm still having trouble connecting the inside face because it's not actually closed. It just looks like it with the symmetry on. And I can kind of tell anytime I have these triangles pop up, that's a place where I really poorly planned how I was going to draw in the faces. So I get a little stuck here. And it's starting to overlap again. But in the interest of completing this, I keep pressing ahead. I can always learn how to use the tools better over time, but I've got to start using them in order to do that. And if I spend way too long in just one area, I'm not going to be finishing any models. After having the major features defined, I'm trying to connect them. As you can see, triangles all over the place, which means I'm not quite pulling it off, but technically it's closing around those areas. Starting to get a lot of overlapping geometry again, but this time I'm not going to restart. I want to enclose the whole body as best as I can, make it manifold, a closed model. So the tail's closed up. The legs, for the most part, are closed. I think I still saw some openings. So technically this model isn't manifold yet. Now when I exit Retopoflow, I see the mesh that was created. I also see the holes in the mesh, which I'll have to patch later. But now that we've got the rough body defined using Retopoflow, I can use Blender's regular tools to clean that up. So I've still got my detailed sculpture, and now I've got a low poly mesh that I can use for animation. In addition to just getting more comfortable with the Retopology tools, I also need to learn how to plan the position of the poles where multiple faces are going to come together. I need to understand edge flow a little bit better and how that's going to relate to animation, where there are different moving parts and I need it to bend at those seams or those edges. All in all, the Retopoflow plugin got me a lot closer to clean topology than using a remesh or a subdivision modifier or decimate would have. And now I have a low poly mesh that's going to be a lot easier not only to animate, but also to start adding textures and do scary things like UV unwrapping and painting in details. So hopefully you'll stick with me through that process. Take care.